Ladies and gentlemen, breaking with tradition, we start on time. So, welcome one, welcome all to the Danube Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for coming to attend the two panels we are hosting today in the quality company, on the one hand, of French economist Jacques Sapir, who is a professor at the Economic War School in Paris, and on the other hand, of our very own macroeconomist and research fellow, Philip Pilkington, who was instrumental in spreading the work of Jacques Sapir throughout the English-speaking world. As Viktor Orban said at The Hague last June and said again in Copenhagen last October, economic decline and losing competitiveness are the greatest threats to Europe at this time. It is my hope that today's program can serve to develop the geopolitical perspective that were thus factorized by the Hungarian Prime Minister at the NATO and European Political Community Summits of 2025. Professor Jacques Sapir has had a long and deep engagement with Russia. Very early in his studies, he chose to focus on the Soviet Union, partly because of family ties, and he specialized in the Soviet economic system. His first research looked at reforms in the USSR during the 1960s, after which he would write a major doctoral thesis on how factories and labor were organized in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and in the 1930s, a period he saw as crucial for understanding how the system works to this day. Over the following decades, he became one of the best-known French specialists on the Soviet and then Russian economy. He worked as a consultant for both the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, and he published important books on the Soviet military system and on the future of Russian military power after the end of the USSR. He has also had a long academic presence in Russia itself. Since the early 1990s, he has taught at major Russian institutions, including the Higher School of Economics and later the Moscow School of Economics, such that in 2016, his work was recognized in Russia when he was elected a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. More recently, he has continued to comment on Russian economic and geopolitical developments, notably through his blog, Russe Europe, launched in 2012, then forcibly closed down in 2017, after which it was rebranded Russe Europe in exile as a column of the geopolitical analysis website Les Crises, run by the actuary Olivier Berruyer. Jacques Sapir also contributes to public debate on the impact of Western sanctions on Russia, especially since the start of the war in Ukraine. Now, I mentioned family ties as the reason for Professor Sapir's interest in Russia in the first place. You could say Professor Sapir's life was intertwined from the very start with Russia, as his father, Michel Sapir, was born in Moscow in 1915. Professor Sapir's father would also go on to become a leader of the French resistance in the southeasternmost tip of France, the Alpes-Maritimes department, whose world-famous prefecture of Nice has been a holiday destination for the Russian upper class since at least the mid-19th century, to the point that there is a fully-fledged Russian Orthodox cathedral in Nice, founded, and to this day still funded, by the Russian community in Nice. I once attended a full Orthodox Mass in it, and I can tell you all that it is impressive. However, what makes the southeast of France especially relevant to today's panel is not merely the topical or the anecdotal, but the historical, in the most contentious sense of the word. Everyone in this room is well aware of D-Day, of the 1944 Allied landings in Normandy, which began the liberation of France and of Western Europe, leading to the defeat of Germany. But lesser known than the landings in Normandy on June the 6th was the landing in Provence, the southeast of France, between August the 15th and September the 14th. Now, this landing in Provence was originally codenamed Operation Anvil, but was delayed, then renamed to Operation Dragoon by Winston Churchill, who considered that he had been dragooned, meaning forced, into eventually approving the landing. Indeed, Churchill would have preferred a breakthrough by the troops already deployed in Italy since 1943 towards the Balkans in order to encircle the German army in Central Europe and reach Berlin before the Soviets. The Soviets. On May the 8th, 2019, the actuary Olivier Berruyer, whom I mentioned before, published on his website Les Crises an article titled The Teaching of Ignorance. Which nation contributed the most to Germany's defeat in 1945? In it, he compared different opinion surveys carried out over several decades by the French Institute of Public Opinion. What Olivier Berruyer found was that in 1945, 57% of French respondents considered the Soviet Union to be the nation that contributed the most to Germany's defeat in 1945, compared with 20% of French respondents considering that it was the United States. When the same question was asked in 2015, the opposite was found. 50% of French respondents considered the United States to be the nation that contributed the most to Germany's defeat, compared with 23% of French respondents considering that it was the Soviet Union. Now, yes, almost 200,000 US citizens died on the Western Front, and over 400,000 were wounded in action, their sacrifices never to be forgotten. Yet over 27 million Soviets gave their lives in the World Anti-Fascist War, and to ignore this reality and its consequences to this day is to live by lies of the worst order, which forbids any trust or mutual understanding ever forming between us. Now, my purpose here is not solely to engage in historical whataboutism. If I believe the landing in Provence is not covered enough, then I would have nothing to gain complaining about a cover-up of it. But instead, it would be my responsibility to ensure that it is covered more. Directing one's energies towards bemoaning ignorance instead of directing them towards fostering cognizance is a pitfall which must be avoided whenever possible, which is to say in all cases. Similarly, if we believe that gross historical and geopolitical illiteracy are a serious problem and must be overcome, it is our responsibility as 21st century Europeans to work diligently towards understanding what our mutual interests are and to act upon them in a rational manner. Currently, Europe is proving itself capable for the third time of destroying itself for the benefit of foreign powers, found today chiefly in the United States of America and in the People's Republic of China. This first panel will present us with the opportunity to make the case that this state of affairs is not an inevitability. In that spirit, it is my honor to hand it over to Professor Jacques Sapir for his own opening presentation.
First, thank you very much, Hugo, for this very kind presentation of mine. And ladies and gentlemen, I will precise that the title of my presentation have somewhat evolved between the time where I sent it to Hugo and now, and I switch to Russia and the West, from fascination to interest, and from interest, of course, to misunderstanding. Well, the question of relationship between Russia and the West is a long-standing problem. It emerged during the reign of Peter the Great, and the gradually increasing Russia integration as a major European power. If we focus onto the modern Russia, post-Soviet Russia, this relation goes through different phases. From the 90s to the end of the 90s, it was quite obviously a time of fascination. Admiration for the West was boundless. I remember being in Soviet Union in 1989, 1988, by then invited by the Central Institute for Mathematical Economics, and then returning in 1990, 1991, admiration for everything done by the West was absolutely everywhere. To the fact that Russia tried to replicate what the West has done, even to the point of actually, turning Russia into a caricature of the West. And from then, the situation evolved progressively, and then came the big crisis of August 1998. As a matter of fact, even before this crisis, we could have seen a subtle change into Russian attitude towards the West. As a matter of fact, I was invited to a fashion event in Moscow by December 1997. And the first thing that I noticed was the return of this very long coat, as they were by this time the coat of the Russian army during the Civil War. Even the so-called, this kind of military, not helmets but coats, which was adopted by the Russian army, and that struck me as a kind of return to a kind of pre-Soviet or early Soviet culture into the then post-Soviet Russia. Now, if we turn back to the very beginning of the 2000s, it was quite obvious that President Vladimir Putin was actually a Westernizer. And if he is a Westernizer, he is also a realist and maybe a nationalist. He is a Westernizer both culturally and strategically by this time. In the same time, he envisioned Russia's futures as integrated into the Western world, which he perceived still in the late 1990s and the very beginning of the 2000s as the engine of economic and technological progress. But in the same time, as a realist and as a nationalist, he was well aware of the fact that states don't have friends. States have only relations of interest. And that's extremely important. He adopted Primakov's ideas on the necessity of closer ties with China and initiated Russia's establishment of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, or SCHOS in Russian, and he ratified the agreement on the regional anti-terrorist structure, RATS, in 2004. As a nationalist or as a patriot, his determination to restore Russia's power as a major regional power never diminished or was never constrained. Contrary to what was claimed in the West by this time, and still is claimed by the West, he never harbored any nostalgia for the Soviet period, that in fact he described as a glorious period. He was thinking about World War II or the Great War, a tragic period and a bygone period. For him, the Soviet period is closed and is not to be replicated. And that's extremely important. In the same time, he intuitively understood that this period, which marked Russia's entry into modernity, the development of Russian industrialization, even if industrialization has developed before the revolution, but was still by 1913 very small. You know, there was only 3 million of blue-collar workers in Russia before World War I. By 1937, there were 7 million blue-collar workers. By 1940, just before the beginning of World War II, 11 million of blue-collar workers. This is extremely important to understand. And it gave rise, of course, of a big push toward Westernism, even if under extremely harsh constraints, and to some extent, we could say that the big hunger of 1932 to 1934 was related to this drive toward industrialization. Vladimir Putin also understands that Russia can only rebuild its economy by this time, after the disastrous 1990s, with the support of the West. And he will therefore attempt to establish relations with Western Europe on the basis of a kind of raw material for technology agreement. He also knows that such an agreement requires, by this time, Washington's approval, and he will therefore do everything he can to court the United States, and will be the first head of state to offer his support to Washington after the attack of September 11. But this realism in international relations will nevertheless lead him to a deep mistrust of the grandiose plan of withdrawing of the maps in the Middle East that are then being developed by the so-called neoconservative circles. One of them just died yesterday, Mr. Dick Cheney, the vice president of George W. Bush. And he will nevertheless be more successful economically with Russia-controlled opening to European investment and the establishment of a de facto partnership based on hydrocarbon export and the import of industrial and manufactured goods. Trade with the EU averaged 45% of the total Russian trade by 2007. Nevertheless, the American policy has provoked a strong opposition in Russia, an opposition which gradually emerged in the late 1990s, even before the arrival of Vladimir Putin to power, notably with the NATO war against Serbia and the beginning of the Kosovo problem. The presence of Wahhabist agitator in Chechnya during the Second Chechen War was perceived, given the close ties by then between the United States and Saudi Arabia, as a form of interference in Russian internal affairs. NATO expansion project, contrary to the commitment made to Mr. Gorbachev, illustrate this point. The United States increased tendency to act unilaterally, a tendency that also, by this time, worried Germany in France, gave rise to the desire of the restoration of more egalitarian international order. Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference of 2007 illustrated this. This speech was largely misunderstood in the West. While the attack on the American policy was, and is still clear, it was not an attack on the political principle of Western order by this time, but rather a desire to rebuild an order more faithful to this political principle. From this perspective, one cannot ignore the recognition by the United States and EU countries, with a notable exception of Spain, of Kosovo independence. This act broke with United Nations jurisprudence and in Russia was and is still perceived as a serious breach of the international order to which the country adhered in 1992. Vladimir Putin then positioned himself as the defender of national sovereignty. He pretended, or perhaps genuinely believed, that Western countries were a kind of homogeneous bloc and was still harboring the same political principle. Yet, the term of sovereignty operated quite out of step between EU countries which were abandoning in principle in favor of a very broad interpretation of the rule of law, and the United States, whose by then the only principle was the law of the strongest. As a matter of fact, between the legacy of the tradition stretching from Jean Baudin of the 16th century to Carl Schmitt of the 20th century, to which implicitly Vladimir Putin lays claim, to the Kelsen tradition increasingly embraced by EU countries, and the Bismarckian tradition, that of the United States then dominated by neoconservatism, there can be no agreement. Does Vladimir Putin sense this, anticipate it, when he mentions other rules in a world that has become ruleless? Or has he made a final effort to rely Western countries, at least some of them, to this sovereignist and conservative vision? We will never know. Or is he already putting the major Western country on trial for betraying their own values? A theme which became one of the major themes of the Russian discourse in the late 2010. The Munich speech offers us possible interpretation. Whichever option one chooses, it is clear that the Russian authorities and Vladimir Putin first and foremost has matured in his westernization. This has become far more realist and far more pragmatic and even maybe instrumental. Ideologically, this westernization no longer holds sway. The attraction of the Chinese model was by then becoming increasingly apparent. It is difficult to gauge the influence of some of its proponents. Nevertheless, the image of the West in the Russian population has not recovered from the crack of the end of the 90s, the big financial crisis. And from this perspective, in 2007, the circle of power in Russia held undeniably more pro-Western position than the general population. Nevertheless, another step was taken in the 2010. This westernization, however realist and instrumental it was to be severely tested in the years that followed. The inability of the Western camp to manage the 2008-2010 crisis came as a shock to Russian and Chinese leaders alike. The mortgage crisis was initially viewed with a certain amusement from Moscow. In early 2008, I was by then invited to the Moscow Forum, which took part in the very last day of January 2008. This crisis was then perceived as a crisis limited to the American financial market. And Alexei Kudrin, the then Minister of Finance, was thus able to deliver a highly optimistic presentation of the situation of Russia. An optimistic assessment which completely neglected the potential effect of this crisis on the Russian economy. And as a matter of fact, the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 indirectly plunged Russia into a severe recession due to the collapse in oil price. The Russian authorities were appalled to discover the amateurishness of the American response and that of the team of George W. Bush, who was nearing the end of his second term. They also discovered the misdeeds of the Anglo-American rating agency and the consequence of the deregulated financial market. From this shock, which was shared also by the shock suffered by China, which lost between a quarter or a third of its foreign exchange reserve in this crisis, a lesson was learned. Westerners could no longer be trusted to manage their own system. And this marked the beginning of a new phase in the rapprochement between Russia and China. In 2009, in the BRIC organization, South Africa was admitted, and then that gave birth to the BRICS, as known today, and it became more and more influential in the Russian foreign policy. The problem was also linked to the trajectory taken by the European Union. Marred in an environmental ideology applied much too dogmatically and increasingly subject to American influence, it ceased to be perceived as a reliable partner. The Russian energy doctrine for 2030, which was adopted in 2010, but publicly discussed since the beginning of 2008, proposed by then a 20-year shift in Russian energy exports from Europe to Asia. I know quite well this document, which was largely discussed in my own research center, and I had several students, some of them Russians, who wrote their PhD about the consequences of this energy doctrine 2030. These exports were to be diversified not only by customer, but also by energy type. And for the first time, nuclear energy was officially placed on an equal footing with gas and oil. In retrospect, the role of this doctrine appears crucial in shifting a realist and assertive Western perspective toward a position of equilibrium between Asia and the West. Added to these economic issues were a series of strategic crises that ultimately undermined the attempt of a reset of Russo-American relation championed by the Obama administration, at least during its first term. The no directly operational prospect for NATO enlargement to the east, decided at the NATO summit in April 2007, would combine with the Ossetian-Georgian crisis of August 2008. The shift in French diplomacy toward a much more pro-American policy, following the election of Nicolas Sarkozy in 2007, was also a fact that was taken into the global view by the Russian leadership. The parenthesis that Franco-German resistance to American hubris in 2002-2003 regarding the Iraq issue had seemed to represent was closing. The signing of a contract between Russia and France for the Mistral-class command and landing ships will only serve to postpone the inevitable. The event in Libya, which led to the fall and assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, and where Western countries far exceeded the mandate they had obtained from the UN with Russia agreement, was significant in persuading Russian leaders that the West was applied a double standard in international politics. This deterioration reached a new turning point when European and American politicians intervened directly in the Maidan protest of December 2013 to January 2014. Faced with a narrative in the Western press which was portraying Russia's reconstruction as a future existential threat to the EU and the West, Russia profoundly altered its own perception of the West. In this triangle between Westernism, realism, and nationalism, the last two, realism and nationalism, were taking more and more precedence. The Maidan massacre of February 2014, and perhaps we should speak of the Maidan provocation, triggered a profound divergence, both cultural and geopolitical. From this perspective, the subtitle of Professor Kachanovsky's book on this event, The Mass Killing That Changed the World, seems perfectly apt. Russian leaders reviewed this event, which forced President Yanukovych to flee despite an attempt at an agreement brokered by the EU, as a provocation made by Europe and by the United States, culminating in a regime change. This led to the decision to annex Crimea under the pretext, not entirely false, of protecting the Crimean Russian-speaking population, a population that would prove to be loyal to Russia, as demonstrated by the referendum immediately organized by Russia. The reaction of Western countries, and in particular, the refusal to recognize this referendum, did not surprise them, but confirmed their analysis of a double standard operating against them. After all, Kosovo's independence has set a precedent in this regard. One can then question the gradual Russian involvement of what was indeed a kind of civil war exploding in Donbass. Maybe the cautious approach, which was chosen first, was hoping for a kind of understanding from European countries. Or maybe was it the result of an analysis that the shift in European countries' policy toward Russia was radical, and that Russia would have no other solution than to intervene, but that the Russian economy and the Russian military was still not able to take the shock. Nevertheless, Russia intervened after summer 2014. This led to the first Minsk agreement, then the second Minsk agreement, and we know then, from the mouth of both French President François Hollande and of former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, that it was just an option used by Western countries to buy time to let Ukraine to rearm. Neither France nor Germany had any intention to really apply the Minsk agreement. And that gave birth into Russia in Russian leadership to a deep misfeeling about the West, to the feeling that the West had been constantly cheating Russia and was no more be followed and was no more be given confidence. Russia, however, didn't suffer all time with Europe and the EU, and it maintained a constant dialogue with the major European countries, including Germany and France. It even maintained its deliveries of a huge quantity of hydrocarbons to the EU, and mostly to Germany, because it was Germany and Italy the biggest consumer of this energy, till 2022, until the beginning of the second row of European sanctions. But NATO's failure to grasp that eastward expansion was an existential problem for Russia, as clearly explained in the 2021 memorandum, led to the misinterpretation of a purely defensive stance as an aggressive one. Even so, Ukraine's potential accession was, on the paper, deferred indefinitely. It was clearly the issues under discussion. Russian leaders concluded then that beneath the veneer of hypocrisy, Western countries have deliberately chosen the path of confrontation. In these same Western countries, every move by Russia was then over-interpreted through the lens of a power portrayed as aggressive. This impasse led to the war in Ukraine in 2022 and the imposition of unprecedented sanctions. The near-complete breakdown of economic relations and Russia now complete shift toward so-called strategic alliance with China and beyond that with Asia. The rejection by the US government of the Russian memorandum of December 2021, which called for a halt to all new NATO accessions, convinced the Russian leaders that NATO had an aggressive intention against Russia and precipitated the formation of what is called now a kind of Russo-Chinese front. The vision of Western countries, and within them European countries, has therefore deeply and profoundly changed between the 1998 crisis and the 2022 one with the beginning of the war in Ukraine. However, this change was not contained within this foundational crisis. While the trajectory that garnered consensus among the Russian political elite from 1999-2000 toward implied significant readjustment in relation between Russia and the West, these readjustments did not necessarily lead to conflict. The behavior of Western countries also bears heavy responsibility in this march toward conflict. American behavior, in particular, was dominated by the hubris of a great power in decline. The European country has failed to develop a genuine strategic position and deliberately abandoned the era of politics, clinging to the belief in the possibility of a governance through rules. From the 2003 Iraq crisis up to the crisis of 2022, with, between them, the NATO expansion of the 2010, and including the subprime mortgage crisis and the Libyan crisis, these countries has provided leaders with all the necessary ammunitions to consider them lawless. Added to this, the economic and technological evolution, which has been experienced a prolonged stagnation since the 2000s, while in the same time, Asia and even the couple of China and India have asserted their preeminence, not only gave to Russia a new alternative to the West, but also convinced Russian leaders that the future of their country now belongs to Asia and no more to the West. The evolution of Russian geopolitical thinkers like Sergei Karaganov, who were Westernizers in the early 2000s, but now hold clear anti-Western position, bear witness to this. Could it be that the period opened by the reign of Peter the Great, by his famed journey to Europe, is drawing to a close? Will the survival of Westernizing ideology, reduced to the moment for a kind of nostalgia of what Europe has been in the past, will be able to withstand criticism, old and new, that it always has generated? Will it be replaced by a new form of Pan-Asianism, removed, in fact, from the so-called neo-Slavophile musing of some, and based on the observation of a technological and economical shift in the world? This is the challenge of the coming years. Thank you.
One, two. It's working. Thank you, dear Jacques Sapir, for this very dense, furnished, and dare I say, daring presentation, as especially the final thesis we have heard here, that Russia could be ending its fascination with the West, since Peter the Great, is an original one, at least to me. I had never heard it before, and I was very interested to hear you tell us the lead up to what you foresee in the near future. Now, we have here prepared a few questions based on several articles, several interviews you have given in the past. In the article you published in Le Monde Diplomatique in December 1999, titled Western Autism Towards Russia, you argued that Western advisors applied ideological macroeconomic recipes to Russia without regard for its institutional and social realities, producing collapse, criminalization, and a lasting sense of humiliation that shaped Russia's later distrust of the West. Looking back 25 years later, do you consider this initial misunderstanding to be the foundational cause of today's geopolitical rupture? And if so, what form of recognition or policy revision by Western governments would be necessary to rebuild a minimum basis of trust?
Well, I think there is a strong difference between a position held by some economists by then and the position which is now held by a large fraction of the political elite in the West. We are not talking of the same thing, you know. If there was a kind of autism, of course, toward the August 98 crisis in Russia, it was a problem much less serious than the situation that developed from the last years. And the problem now is, whatever the change we could hope in the European and the Western political elite, the most important problem will be to restore confidence in Western actions. Russia has been cheated so often by the West that to rebuild this confidence, we could have to implement a policy that we could not support from our internal policies. This is a very important contradiction. So I don't hope a quick restoration of relations between Western Europe and Russia, or between the West, what the Russian call the collective West, okay, and Russia, even if the term is collective West, is far of being perfect, because some countries which are included in this group have different options. Just look at how Japan behaved with President Trump. When President Trump asked the new Japanese Prime Minister to stop the buying of oil and Russian gas, Prime Minister, this lady said, well, no way. This is in fundamental Japanese interest, and we are not to obey you on this point. The collective West could not be as collective as it seems. But nevertheless, it will take time, at least 3 or 5 years, to restore this confidence. And it will take, certainly, an agreement of all concerned countries to abide by formal rules of behavior to restore at least some confidence. I would say that the situation is even worse than during the Cold War in the 1970s. You know, in the 1970s, whatever the level of conflict between Soviet Union and the United States and the West, at the very least, both camps could agree on armament limitation agreements. The treaties on ICBMs, the treaties again anti-ballistic missile, then the START treaties. Okay, so whatever the level of conflict, we had a kind of confidence, and even if the saying by then, I was an advisor of French diplomacy and the French military establishment by then was, okay, trust but verify. That's fine, but there is still the formula, trust. And now, the Russia will not trust the West, and the West will not trust Russia. So the situation is even worse than during the Cold War. We have to understand that. And we have to understand also what kind of way we could adopt to move from this situation onto a situation of, at the very least, trust, but verify. And this is linked to the fact that the West will, in the end, accept the principle to be constrained by the same rule that he wants to apply to Russia. Without that, there could be no agreement.
See, Philip, what about you? Are you optimistic, pessimistic about really restoration of relations, and how collective does the West seem to you?
Well, to take it from the original question about the reforms in the 90s, I think it's becoming increasingly clear as time passes and as we get a better idea of what actually happened, that there was kind of a dual standard applied in the post-Soviet reform period. Notably, Jeffrey Sachs has talked about this. I mean, people can say that Jeffrey Sachs has heterodox views on geopolitical matters, but the fact of the matter is Jeffrey Sachs was one of the key economists advising many of these countries. And so we have to take what he says seriously. And he says that different standards were applied in Poland than in Russia. It's clear to me that they were, and I would summarize them this way, and I think this is increasingly going to be the view moving forward, is that is that what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed was that Western capital flowed into the former Soviet Union. That capital was backed implicitly or explicitly by military power. Very explicitly, for example, in Serbia, less so explicitly in Hungary, for example. And I think basically what happened was, if the West, mainly the United States, decided that you were a reasonable and decent partner, Hungary, Poland, and so on, what they did was they tried to kind of meld with your local companies. They didn't, I'm not saying that they were in favor of national sovereignty, I don't think they were, but there was a melding of sorts. It was still an extractive process to some extent, but I think it was mutually beneficial in some way. When they decided that they didn't like you, they acted like pirates and they looted. That's exactly what happened. That's what happened in Russia. That's what happened in Serbia. That's what happened in former Yugoslavia. These were the two big military powers, you know. I don't think it's a coincidence that the two big military powers were looted, effectively. And the looting operations had no economic value for the countries that had to suffer them, frankly. And so we had a reaction. Now, the issue, here's why I think going back to that is really important, that capacity no longer exists militarily or economically anymore. Because piracy isn't a great way of doing business on the world stage. It works for a little while, doesn't work for a very long time. And I think that's what we're coming up against here, because basically what happened, the West was confronted with a very unique set of historical circumstances when the Soviet Union collapsed. Deindustrialization had already begun by the 1990s. It actually began in the 70s when Japan and Germany came back from their post-war period, and it began to suck the life out of the American economy, mainly also the British economy. And not so much the French, actually, but that's a slightly different story. And so the Western economies by the mid-1990s, certainly when the looting and the mind melding with the former Soviet bloc was in process, was partially financialized already. Manufacturing was leaving or it was closing down, and the new business model became export of financial capital. You can read about this in Das Kapital. You can read about this in Marx. He'll say, look, you have the Dutch economy. It's the height of manufacturing. The manufacturing dies. It goes to England. Dutch capital stays around. And capital can be productive when you have a financial sector, or it can be predatory, or it can be some mix of both. And that's always what happens in these periods. The problem is, eventually the Dutch banking sector stops mattering, and the City of London grows up, and you don't need the Dutch banking sector anymore. The Dutch banking sector itself came, if you know your economic history, from the Venetian banking sector. It was effectively transferred over, and that came from low-level criminality and gambling, actually, which is a really interesting story that's not often told. But basically what I'm saying is that period is now coming to an end. And it's coming to an end because partially of the dynamics that the conflict has set off. I'm thinking about the de-dollarization here. The entire structure of this capacity, whether to meld with other countries and pull them into your geo-economic orbit or to loot, both of them require a kind of a strong dollar capacity to lend, very strong Wall Street model in place. And that model's dying. That model's dying right before our eyes. I worked on Wall Street for 10 years. It wasn't the same Wall Street I went into as the one I left. And that was post-2008. It's becoming very noticeable. We could go into the signs of de-dollarization now, but I'll just say, look at interest rates in Europe, look at interest rates in China, and look at interest rates in the United States. They are double, almost double in the United States. This is not a period of a strong dollar. So the economic capacity's gone. And I just note something from last week. The Financial Times reported that the Tony Blair Institute was laying off staff. Now, that may not mean much to people who don't know what institutes like the Tony Blair Institute do, but if you know what the institutes like the Tony Blair Institute do, you'll know that that's a sign that people are no longer interested in that type of business. That signals the end of a geo-economic power on the part of the West. So I'd say I don't think it's really in the West's hands. I think China is a much more powerful economy than Europe or the United States. I just think it is. I think it's just proved that in the trade talks. And I think we've kind of come to the end of the road that we began at the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, where we did some good things, we did some bad things, but they were all based on financial capital. And that financial capital and the geo-economic power behind it is slipping away.
See, so while our economic situation is grim, while we're blue, we must all remember the East is red. Well, onto another question I wanted to ask. In the interview you give for Philip on the 6th of November 2017, you challenged the common Western image of pre-revolutionary Russia as economically archaic, showing instead a dynamic, state-steered industrialization with strong growth but deep structural dualities. To what extent do you see this long-standing Western habit of misreading Russia's development model as conditioning today's misunderstanding of Russia's economic resilience and strategic logic? And what might shift in Western policy if this historical misreading were corrected?
Well, the story of Western misunderstanding of Russia ran well into the 19th century, as a matter of fact. It's true that Russia was a half-developed and a half-non-developed country in 1930. At the eve of the First World War, we had some aspects of the Russian economy which were extraordinarily modern, like the big factories in the St. Petersburg economic regions, and some other which were clearly archaic and belonging to the past, to the 18th century, even to the 17th century. And all the contradiction which gave birth to the revolution. After all, it was not for nothing that there was a revolution by this time in Russia. It's just not the only consequences of the World War. It was deep to much profound, much deeper contradiction in the country. But what is striking is that the Western view only focalized on the archaic part and the archaic part of Russia and never understood the process giving birth to the most developed part. This was resumed in the 20th century till 1957, the first Sputnik. And then this perception turned completely down, to the fact that the United States began to speak of a missile gap with Soviet Union. And a great Sovietologist by then, Marshall Schulman, wrote a very important paper, I think it was in 1959, in Foreign Policy. Are Soviets 10 feet tall? And he explained that if the Soviets are to overcome the United States in the next year, they must be 10 feet tall, because that doesn't compute with the real Soviet achievement so far. So we always balanced between a complete underestimation of the Russian and Soviet situation, or to some time to a complete overestimation. Look what happened now. You have people who are saying in nearly the same sentence, first, the Russian army is not working. Look, they didn't make some very important improvement of their situation in Ukraine, which is, by the way, is not true, but okay. And after that, but nevertheless, in the next 3 years, Russia will be a major threat for NATO countries. Well, people, either the first stand true or the second stand true, but not both, not at the same time. It's impossible. And in the end, I think that this situation results from first a lack of knowledge of the actual Russian situation. You know, a lot of the so-called experts in the West never went outside Moscow or St. Petersburg. I am not to say that I have seen all Russia, because a full life will not be enough for that. But at least with my colleagues, with my Russian colleagues, with French colleagues of my Russian center, we traveled from Moscow to Novosibirsk, Ufa, Kazan, all the Arkhangelsk, onto the south, to the border with Azerbaijan and Iran. Okay. So we had a real view of what is the actual development of Russia. Of course, Russia is still a poor country if compared with some very advanced Western Union country. The PPP GDP, the GDP computed in purchasing power parity, is 3.7% of the world GDP, when Germany is 3.4%. But Germany is a country of 80 million of inhabitants, and Russia of more than 140 million. So yes, Russia is still poorer than Germany or France. Okay. But nevertheless, it improved considerably since 1998. Here again, in purchasing power parity, the Russian GDP was multiplied by a factor of 2.3 in more or less 25 years. Okay? In the same time, the GDP of France or Germany increased just by 30%. So the global growth of Russia is actually very impressive. And we have to combine both. Yes, Russia is still a poorer country than Germany and France. No problem with that. But yes, Russian GDP is increasing much faster than in these two countries. And this is why talking about Russia as an emergent country, whatever the defect we could find with this kind of appellation, is still quite relevant. Because after the big catastrophe of the 1990s, we are seeing the rebirth of a true and innovative Russia. So the inability to see the both ways, you know, is a major problem in the West. A lot of specialists are still saying, well, yes, Russia is poorer than Germany and France, which is true. But they are not seeing the fact that the growth in Russia has been much faster than in our both countries, in France and Germany. And in the same way, some people are saying, well, Russia is to become a giant in the next 10 or 15 years. No. There will be 3 giants in the world economy: China, United States, and India. Russia could be, at best, the 4th of this country. But still, it will be a much bigger economy than the German or the French economy. Not the whole EU, but the whole EU is not a country. It's a coalition of different countries. So I think that this is the major problem in estimation of the real size of Russia.
I see. What do you feel? Is Russia a paper bear?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, it's just won a war against NATO, so it's definitely not a paper bear. No, I'll say to what Professor Sapir just said on the knowledge issue. I think it's actually a lot worse than what you think. I know what you're saying. The tendency for this kind of bipolar view goes right back to Kremlinology, Sovietology days. You can read about it. You can read about Team B in the 1980s, thinking that they had 3 times the nuclear weapons or something that they thought. They tended to be the hawks, actually. Back in the Cold War, the hawks used to overestimate, and the doves used to. It's the opposite now, which is funny. But actually, the problem's a lot worse because no matter how much bipolarity there was in the assessments of the Soviet Union, there were always serious attempts at assessment because it was seen as not just intelligence work, but it was seen as almost the highest intelligence work. It was effectively they were interested in nuclear capabilities. That was kind of sacrosanct. They had to know what type of missiles they had, how many, and so on. And then below that was military power, and military power depended on economic output. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, but economists were in high demand back in the Cold War days. Not anymore at all. I think what's happened actually is that because of the rise of a lot of think tanks, obviously lower quality think tanks than the Danube Institute naturally, but because of the rise of proliferation of think tanks, especially around foreign policy, propaganda's begun to seep into that. Now, there was, of course, propaganda in the Cold War, but it was mainly ideological propaganda. They were communist, they were atheist, etc., etc. The propaganda didn't tend, as far as I can tell, to lean into the technical analytics. I think because of the rise of the think tankocracy, you might call it, it's started to seep into the analytics. And so there's not actually a great deal of serious consideration done on, for example, the power of the Russian economy. Or I'll give you another example now, the power of the Iranian economy. I don't even know much about the power of the Iranian economy, but I know it's not what we're being told because I know what happened with Russia. I'll just give you a really concrete example of this. So I spent most of my career working in the finance sector in the City of London and Wall Street and so on. And I was tasked with valuing Russian government debt after not after the 2014 invasion, but it was after the Obama administration engineered a decline of the oil price. Now, the State Department's never admitted this, but I'm pretty sure that the Obama administration in 2015, 2016 engineered a decline in the oil price with the Saudis to crash the ruble, and it created a mild currency crisis in Russia. This provoked some inflation. I think the Russians thought it was going back to 99. It wasn't. They over-exaggerated. Nabulina, the central banker, raised interest rates. Interest rates were very high. I was asked to assess whether those interest rates would come down, because if the interest rates came down, it would be the best, the investment of the year would be Russian government debt. And I looked at it and I analyzed it in line basically to value the ruble. I won't get into the technical details, but there was a way of doing that. You build a ruble model. And I said, yeah, it's a buy. It's a buy. We didn't buy them, I don't think. But I said it's a buy, and it turned out to be, I think it was the investment of the year or something like that. Russian bonds came down because the currency stabilized and interest rates came down. Why am I saying this? Because I was an analyst in my late 20s in a reasonably respectable finance firm. But, wasn't the top currency guy at Goldman Sachs or anything like that. Okay, roll forward to 2022. Invasion happens, the sanctions begin. And I looked at it and I said, Joe Biden came out and famously made the statement, we are going to turn the ruble to rubble. He also claimed that they were going to halve Russian GDP. Now, if you want to know how difficult it is to halve an economy's GDP, I'm not even sure if the Soviet Union's GDP halved. Maybe Zimbabwe's after the land seizures. I mean, it's really hard to halve GDP. But okay, you could say that's rhetoric. The plan clearly was to collapse the ruble. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. I know from the modeling days that when I was in finance sector that the ruble is an oil currency. And effectively, you adjust the ruble for inflation and then it'll track oil. And then linear regression, it's very easy to do. Won't get into the technicals. But, an analyst in their 20s can figure that out. It's not It's, it's reasonably technical macroeconomics, but nothing, really out there or anything. And using fairly standard methodology. And I said, well, of course, the war is going to drive up the oil price, which it did. The energy prices went up. And so the ruble's going to appreciate. And I wrote something on this, and this was a week after the invasion, and people said, you're crazy. The ruble's not going to appreciate. We've just slapped sanctions. And of course, the ruble appreciated because that's how you do economic analysis. And then I found out that the person who'd imposed the sanctions was a guy working at the Obama administration called Dalip Singh. I met Dalip Singh because he used to be at Goldman Sachs. He was a chief guy at Goldman Sachs. Now, here's the other thing. I knew people at Goldman Sachs were skeptical of the sanctions. I knew this because I used to work in Wall Street. I was getting text messages, and they said, yeah, Phil, I think your analysis is like, not Goldman guys, but like guys who know, everyone knows each other in those circles. So I said, what is going on? Dalip Singh, I met him in the Obama administration over Greece, and he was a Goldman guy, and then he went to Wellington. He was a friend of a friend. And I said, how is Dalip Singh not getting on the phone and talking to people, and them saying, I don't think that's going to work so well. And then I realized it's not being driven by that. The entire foreign policy, all of the sanctions, everything, was not being driven by economic reality. There was no analysis being done. We weren't doing analysis anymore after the Cold War. And then, just to put a final bow on this, who's out now riding in public except Ian Proud? Go and look him up. He wrote the sanctions out of the British embassy in Moscow. Ian Proud is out writing about various issues now that he's retired as a diplomat. And he said he always thought the sanctions were rubbish. He thought they were complete nonsense. This guy wrote them. I think he was over in Budapest earlier at Budapest Global Dialogue. So my point on that is there's some very concrete pieces of evidence that say that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was, it was propagandized about, everything like that, but the analysis was treated as sacred and decisions were made based on the actual analysis. I don't think that's happening anymore. And it's actually dangerous, but it's not dangerous for Russia, it's dangerous for us.
Tragic consequences of the becoming Bruno Le Maire of the Biden administration. There's a last article I wanted to address, which was an interview of you published in the blog of Bertrand Renouvin, who is a French royalist. He was a royalist candidate, actually, in the 1970s. So this is a 2025 January interview in which you argued that the BRICS have shifted from a voice within Western-led institutions to building exit alternatives, aiming to supplant the West under United Nations legitimacy. Now, what specific institutional moves could realistically scale without fragmenting trade and finance? Yeah, I wrote that. And what minimum reforms should Western states offer in the IMF or World Bank to order to pull the global South back toward a voice in the global concert of nations, rather than a destabilizing bifurcation thereof?
Well, first, you have to remember that I was using Alfred Hirschman classification, loyalty, voice, or exit. It's a book he wrote in the beginning of the 60s, which is still a very, very important book. Okay. What I was saying by then is BRICS at the beginning was built as an organization to foster the voice of emerging countries, China, India, Russia, among Western institutions. But the problem is that the United States mostly, but not only the United States, also the EU, blocked this process. I remember, you have to know that I have been the adjunct professor for Dominique Strauss-Kahn when he was a professor in the French university. And I know him quite well, and I know his defects also quite well. They were openly known in the French academic world, by the way. Okay, but when he took command of the IMF, we had a discussion with him, and he told me, "Yes, you're right. I am to give an increasingly important share of voting to China to equate the voting share of China in the IMF with the actual weight of the Chinese economy. That was his thinking. And he was blocked by the United States, who said, no way. You could increase the weight of China, but not to the point that it would challenge the West. And this is a very, very important thing to know. I don't know that it was because of that he had, after all these problems, I think he was absolutely able by himself to destroy himself. This is another point. But at least we had this question clearly put on the table. And after 2012, 2014, the mood in the BRICS shifted from voice up to exit. And with the creation of the new development bank by the BRICS, you know, this bank is headed by a Brazilian, by the former president of Brazil, but is placed in China, as a matter of fact. We had the beginning of this move toward exit. And I think that now China, but also India, is putting a much greater stress onto an exit strategy than onto a voice strategy. In the development of a specific trading arrangement which will allow countries to circumvent the US dollar and the possibility of US sanctions. So the problem for Western countries is either to stop financial sanctions, and then maybe, because the dollar still has a dominant role into finance, into trading and finance, could survive. Or if they are keeping with the strategy of sanction, not only against Russia, but also against Iran, against Cuba, and a lot of other countries, then more and more countries will use the Chinese system and will circumvent the US dollar. You have just to understand one thing. President Trump came some days ago to Indonesia, and he met with the current president of Indonesia, Mr. Prabowo Subianto. Okay, they had very, very important speaks, okay? And the very day when Trump left Indonesia, left Jakarta, the Indonesian president announced that he was making some loans in yuan under a Chinese guarantee. There could be not a more precise message sent to Donald Trump, you know, to say, okay, you want to come, you are welcome. You want to have a discussion with us? No problem. But we will not work now under your own rule. We will choose our own rule or rule set by a friendly country like China. This is a very important message sent to the Trump administration. After that, you had the meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister, you know? And the first thing the Japanese Prime Minister said, well, we are big friends, there is no problem. But we will not stop our buying of Russian oil and Russian gas because it is in the national interest of Japan. So all this trip into Asia turned to be not a political defeat for Trump, but at least a political embarrassment for him. And this is extremely important to keep that in memory, you know. Now we have more and more countries which are agreeing with the exit strategy. So the only solution for the West could be to stop all financial sanction, all monetary sanction. If the West, and mostly the United States, are not doing that, in the next 3 or 5 years, more and more countries will have chosen the Chinese system of transaction, avoiding the US dollar, and then the shock to the US dollar will be absolutely unavoidable.
Thoughts, Phil?
Yeah, I think this kind of ties into some of what I was saying about the 1990s beginning of the financialization model. That was the beginning. I think we're at the end. I think I alluded to that earlier. The issue is another thing that's kind of grown up, and it ties into all the other things that we're talking about. It ties into the tendency to think in ideological or to think in propaganda terms and so on. Is basically that the West and the United States in particular, but the European Union suffer from this too. They think that like regulating things gives them power. I know that the United States always laugh at Europe in that regard, but actually the United States are the regulator in chief. When they say we're shutting down SWIFT or something like this, SWIFT isn't a technology. Maybe it was in 1974 or something. It's not a real technology anymore. It's a regulatory system. And all these things these sanctions and everything are forms of regulation in a sense. They're not actually trade war or anything like that. That's a slightly different issue that has to do with tariffs and so on. We've seen a bit of that recently. And so there's this thinking is really sticking around, and it won't go away, is my fear. I agree with you that it would be productive for the West to stop engaging in sanctions. They're destroying themselves. Not just with the energy sanctions, that's obvious. I mean, if anyone denies that now, I don't know what to tell them. But, you know, the US dollar is strangling itself in the crib, engaged in all these financial sanctions. You can sanction maybe Iran. I think that's probably the largest country you can get away with sanctioning. And anything bigger than Iran, you're playing with fire in a sense. But the problem kind of runs deeper than that, and it's what you alluded to about Chinese lending. There's a quote I really like from the economist Hyman Minsky. He said that anyone can create money, the problem is getting it accepted. And what he meant was anyone can really create money. If I create an IOU and give it to you and you give me some bread or you mow my lawn or something like that, I've kind of created money in a sense. I can also create a debt to you, an informal debt, a gambling debt, something like that. Anyone can create money, but the issue is getting it accepted. And the United States has kind of it's kind of coasted along with this mythology. It's never really explained to itself why the dollar has the power that it does. I remember the popular explanation back in the day. It actually was more popular with kind of left-wing economists, actually Marxian economists, or not so much post-Keynesians, but Marxian economists found it popular, which was that the military in some way backed the US dollar. And you kind of had these myths floating around, like Saddam Hussein was finally taken out because he was going to buy dollars outside of war. None of this was ever true. I used to joke with people that if the military backs the US dollar, then if I take a $10 note to a Federal Reserve Bank, they might give me a piece of a tank, That's how meaningless it is, in a sense. What does it mean? It means that if you don't use a dollar when you go on holiday, a GI jumps out of the bush and takes a pop at you with an M16. I mean, it's an absurd idea. It makes absolutely no sense. The reality is the dollar has its hegemonic status because of what you might call network effects. People use the dollar because they use the dollar. Baron von Munchausen, pull yourself up with your shoelaces. It really is like that. Money is like that in a lot of ways. We won't get into that, but that's basically what it was. And then the other layer on top of that for the kind of hegemonic US dollar system was low interest rates. Always keep your interest rate lower than your neighbors. Because if European interest rates are lower than the United States, as they are today, people will start borrowing in euros. And guess what's happening? US corporates are currently borrowing in euros. It's called the reverse Yankee trade. People are making a ton of money in it in Frankfurt and London and so on. So there's a kind of element of make-believe to currency hegemony, and then there's also a tangible thing that keeps it in place, which is high interest rates. I want to highlight here, none of this has to do with the closing of the financial system or the closing of China's capital account or anything like that. US dollar hegemony was already there during Bretton Woods when we had closed capital accounts, okay? So euro-dollar markets opened, I think, in the late 60s, definitely by the early 70s. There were fixed exchange rates in place when that happened. So you don't need floating exchange rates, you don't need an open capital account, you don't need anything like that. What do you need to start gaining currency hegemony over your partner? Issue a loan. It's as simple as that. And if people accept the loan, that's it. And Merrill Lynch, an American firm, over the course of the summer, issued a panda bond, a big yuan loan. And then you can take that yuan and you can either use it for something, you can try and spend the yuan on Chinese imports, or you can try and spend it abroad, see if somebody will accept it. Or you can go to the offshore renminbi market and you can exchange it for euros or dollars and you can use them to make your purchases. But you owe that money in yuan. What I'm saying is that there is no magic beanstalk or anything behind the dollar. It's not backed by military power. All of that is make-believe. And what is actually backs it is just that people believe in it and interest rates are low. And right now, as Professor Sapir said, people aren't believing it anymore. They're scared of it. And interest rates are high. And so people are moving. And that's really the end of that. And how it relates to BRICS, well, BRICS is going to start using alternative financial transactions. They already have, as you say, in Indonesia and so on. They're going to start using yuan. They're going to probably start using rubles for energy purchases. That's the next shoe to drop. Or rupees from India, because they're just going to start putting in circulation and people will just get used to using them. And there doesn't need to be a hegemonic currency. You can have a multilateral currency system. Barry Eichengreen has written multiple papers on this that everybody ignores for some reason, even though he's the most prominent currency historian in the world and ever has been. So these changes are taking place. It actually doesn't even matter if the BRICS stays as an important organization or it falls apart because people disagree. The economic processes are already in motion, and I don't think there's any stopping them.
So-called decoupling of China is a case of when you raise your left hand in the mirror, you see your right hand being raised, you could say. Ladies and gentlemen, we have like 3 minutes left to take like a question or two, but thankfully, you'll have a 30-minute break to swarm Mr. Sapir with your other questions if we don't have time for your inquiries at this time. Who would like to ask a question in this audience? Aha, right here, sir.
Even Metternich said that Russia is not as strong as it seems to be, and she is not as weak as seems to be. And always the misperception and the misunderstanding of Russia was a phenomenon during the last 2 centuries. And also, I want to ask that why the West do not understand the process of dissolution of the Soviet Union, and as experts say, usually the Soviet Union dissolved not into nation states but small Soviet unions, and the dynamics of the whole Ukrainian war is misunderstood. Instead, why the West thinks as a crusade, as a holy war.
So could you just repeat directly in the form of a simple question, perhaps?
Why the West thinks about the Ukrainian war as a holy war between the good and bad, and why became the Western politicians Ukrainian jingles?
Well, you have first to figure out the problem in the so-called EU ideology. The EU is sticking to the idea of European values. I don't know what they are. Or more precisely, I understand what is some principle of actions, some principles of behavior. Values. I know financial values, but ideological values, not really. Okay, that's a problem. But because of that, the EU want to take a kind of high ground on moral issues. The problem is, this kind of high ground is of any value by itself only if all of the countries are behaving that they are living in a world governed by the problem of values. If not, there is no point in doing that, you know. If you are facing country that belong into a Bismarckian world or in a Carl Schmitt world, you know, the very moral values or ideological values that you are fostering will have absolutely no effect on the behavior of other countries. And that's the main ideological problem in the EU. The EU believes that every country in the world is behaving like the EU. No, it is not. A lot of countries are behaving along different kind of principles. We can discuss this principle. We can even find that some moral values fostered by the EU could be better in a moral sense to some other principle. It is not relevant. What is relevant is the fact, do we have a common core of principles that unite every country of the world? We don't have. This is extremely, extremely important to understand. And because we don't have this kind of policy, which try to build something onto this kind of moral or ideological value, this kind of policy is bound to fail every time. And then either we're back to an absolutely rule-less world, which is not a good thing, I will say, or could we agree onto a limited number of principles that could be shared by different countries? I think that that's the real problem so far. And this is one of the main failure of the EU toward Russia. And I will say even more, you know, the West has liked Russia and the Russians. So far, they tried to be good European. But the Russians are not Europeans. They have part of their culture linked to Europe. Yes, of course, we all know that. But they have also other part of their culture which is linked to the Asian heritage of Russia. And actually, Russia is a kind of midterm country, you know, a country which belongs both, by some aspect, to Europe and to some aspect to Asia. And not understanding this truth has led to a deep misunderstanding about Russia and the Russians, with this effect that when Western people suddenly discovers that Russian doesn't behave like us, yes, I said, well, Russian are a kind of barbarous people. They are just a people of their own, as we are in France, as the German are, as every people are. So the fact to trying to build some moral values into international values has led probably to the biggest mistake in international politics since the last 20 or 30 years. And this is why the attempt made by President Putin in 2007 in his speech at the Munich conference to go back to a core of principle that will be acknowledged by all and respect by all was probably an attempt doomed to fail, but at least was an attempt to rebuild a kind of international community. And the actual situation is that we have no more an international community. That is, we have no more the kind of an international language that we could share and that we could use with all other countries and be understood by all other countries. This is one of the major challenges for international relations in the coming years.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jacques Sapir and Philip Pilkington, we will be back